The Kephalos Challenge, memorizing the first 100 lines of the Iliad in 100 days. For more than 3 months, you've watched me in Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts learning by heart verse 1 through verse 100, putting the Kephalos Method into practice, while heroes from around the world have joined me in hashtag Kephalos Challenge. Today, 100 days later, we're going to find out if I can actually recite all 100 lines from memory.
Time's up.
And what is the Kephalos Method? The Kephalos Method is memorizing some number of lines of the Iliad or the Odyssey before trying to parse every bit of grammar, before trying to understand every single vocabulary word, and certainly not by trying to translate every little piece of it. No, we're going to avoid all of that. We want the Homeric verses to seep into our psyches, just like the ancient Greeks and Romans did when they learned Homer. What did they do? They memorized in their schools lines, whole passages of the Iliad and the Odyssey. That was the core of their education. I introduced the Kephalos Method 100 days ago on my other channel, Scorpio Martianus, and I challenged myself and the whole world to commit to memory the first 100 lines of the Iliad and to be able to recite all of them by today. I named the Kephalos Method after my colleague Michael Kephalos Kopf from the Ancient Language Institute. At the Ancient Language Institute, we teach you to read ancient languages fluently: Latin, Ancient Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and Old English. And the way we do that is that we immerse you in the language. We speak to you from day one in that ancient language that you're studying, and on that same day, you will start to speak in that language with your instructor. In a matter of months of study, you're going to be having discussions in Latin, in Ancient Greek, in Biblical Hebrew, in Old English about the text that you're reading. That's how you get to be a fluent reader. That's how we do it at the Ancient Language Institute. The Latin for Kids program is also getting started this fall. This is for elementary, middle school, and high school students. It's a year-long program, but you have to sign up soon. In fact, you need to sign up by August 10th in order to take part in the classes that begin the fall term. And something else that Ancient Language Institute does is full immersion camps. In fact, right now is the Ancient Greek Full Immersion Homer Camp. Now, I can't be there myself, but in solidarity with my friends and colleagues there, I am going to take this Kephalos challenge. I'm going to tell you more about the Kephalos Method and how Kephalos himself stumbled upon it a little bit later. But the gist is that you memorize some number of lines of the Iliad or the Odyssey, and that is your introduction to the epics, rather than using grammar translation or trying to read it exactly as it is, because the dialect is so different from normal ancient Greek. So how many lines should you actually commit to memory? I think at least 10 is a good start. I committed myself to 100 lines, and in order to make that as easy as possible for myself to do, I decided to turn it into a song. It's easier to memorize a poem rather than just remembering prose, and it's easier to commit to memory a song than a poem. So what I did is I used the natural accents that are in this pitch accent language of ancient Greek, and I created little simple melodies based off those natural pitch accents. And I turned all of that into an audiobook to help me memorize each individual line in each of the 14 sections, the scenes. I divided the first 100 lines into thematic scenes so I could understand what was going on in the story and recall each of those 14 scenes or sections. And I put that audiobook, Iliad 100, on my audiobook store so you too can memorize the first 100 lines of the Iliad. In a few minutes, I am going to sit in that gazebo and recite the best that I can, if I can, all 100 lines of the first book of the Iliad. But how exactly am I going to judge if I've done a good job or not? I don't think I'm going to be able to do it perfectly, so we need to have some scoring. Okay, so there are 100 lines. Therefore, let's make it 100 points. That means if I do a line entirely correctly, that's 1 point. Well, how do I judge if it's correct or not? Does it have to be exactly as I recite it in my audiobook, Iliad 100? Not necessarily. Obviously, I can change the tempo. And what kind of mistakes would I tolerate or not? Well, mistakes I would not tolerate. If I recite a line, that might be correct, but if it's out of order, like I skip a line, I switch them or something, I'm going to take off a whole half point for that. well, what if I use an incorrect vowel quality? For example, if the line is e, de, and I say it de, or something like that, if I switch that, for each one of those, it would be 1/10 of a point that I would take off. I'm gonna give myself a little bit of leeway for the mid-vowels, possibly. For example, epsilon and omicron, I have variably pronounced those, even in the audiobook, as true mid e and o, and high e and o. Occasionally, they even lower from the true mid position. I'm gonna be not too hard on myself when it comes to that. If I do a consonant incorrectly, including aspiration and voicing, for example, if I say bioyo with pa, which is the letter pi, instead of bioyo, something like that, I would take off 1/10 of a point for that. Also, if I do or do not do aspiration, for example, something like balim plank tentas. Yeah, balim plank tentas, especially the second one. It can't be balim plank tentas. That I would consider to be incorrect. And also if I do an accent wrong. Now there's a little bit of freedom I'm going to give myself with the accents. If there is a high accent, which we have in, say, an acute or in a circumflex, there needs to be some kind of a fall there that comes after it. The maximum number of penalties I could incur is just 10 in any given line. So even if I get half of it right, if it has 10 things wrong in it, I am not going to count that line as one of my points to the 100 points. Okay. However, if I am aware of a mistake, I can go back and correct it to receive credit, even up to a full point, if all the mistakes in that line are corrected. I can pause, I can take as long as I need to try to remember. This is not a timed exercise. In the audiobook that I made, it takes about 14 minutes for that audiobook to play at that consistent pace. To do all 100 lines, I expect to do this in hopefully under a half hour, so I can pause as much as I want. And my goal is to get 80% or better. So that's some kind of a B. A, I would love to get an A, using the American scoring system. I'd love to get an A, but I'd love to get it perfect. I doubt I'll get it perfect because I've never actually recited all 100 lines from memory. I've never tried before. This is my first time trying after having practiced each individual section, mostly just listening to my own audiobook. So hopefully I'll get 80% or better. Let's see what happens. Let's go to the gazebo. All right, looks like I'm set here. Got my microphone. Scorpio Martianus representing. Today is, in fact, Friday, July 26th. Oh my gosh, I added the light by mistake. We're not editing this. There's no editing. I turned on the flashlight by mistake. We're not editing this. This is Friday, July 26th. I have to complete this challenge today. I have to recite all 100 lines of the Iliad from memory as best I can, maybe with errors, with eyes closed. You can see there's no listening devices in my ear either. So I'm going to, in fact, do this from memory. And we'll see how many mistakes I make. If I can actually remember every line, we're going to see what happens. This is my first time trying it. Now, I'm also going to record this stopwatch on this device here so that I can put it on the screen. I think that'll be nice, just to prove that I'm not making any cuts in this video. This is a learning experience, and it's okay for all of us to make mistakes. All right, so I'm recording the screen here, so and now I'm going to start. Oh wait, hold on a second. I need to drop the pitch pipe. That's right, I have here a pitch pipe that I had back from my old a cappella days, and let's see if it still works after dropping it. And let's get the right notes here. We got A flat and we got that way I get the right notes, and I can go from one part to the other. All right. Starting here now, I'm going to put that up on the screen later in editing. My first time trying to recite all 100 lines of the first rhapsode of the Iliad from memory. Menina edetea pelleia deo Achilleos Ulomenen he myria kaioi salgeeteki Bolas diptimus psychasai di proiapsen Hero naudus de heloria teuce cunessin Oio noisite passi dios de telie tubule exudeta prota diaste tenerisante, Atreides de Anaxandron Caidios Achilleus, distars poeteon eridixun hece macestai, letus Caidios huios hogar basilei colotis, nus ona nastraton orseca genole conto de laui, Hunecaton crucen, et imasenare terra, Atreides, hogarelte toas epineas caion, lysomenos de tuca traperon taparesia boina, stemmatekon encer sineke bolua bolonos, crusoiena skeptroi kai liseto pantas caius, Pantas caius Atreida de malista duo cosmetore laon. Atreidae de cae alloie iucnemi de sacaioi. Iumin mentioi doien Olympia domate contes. Ec persae priamoi opolin. Eudoi canticestai. Baida de moi lusai de pilen, da de boina de cestai. As dominoi, Dios huion hece bolona polona. Entaloi men, pantes, epeo pemes anacaioi. Aedis tai tierea cae agladec taia boina. Alu Atreidei Agamemnoni hendane tu moi. Alacacos apie crateron depimuton et ille. Mesegeron coile sinego paraneusikikeo. Niun de tunente hysteronautis ionta. Menutoiu kraisme skeptron kai stemmate uiu. Tendego luso prin min kai gera sepesin meteroi en ioikoi en argeite loti patres histomenen kai mon lekos antiosan alitide meretis thesaoteros hoskenei Hosepatemtesen hogeron kai epitetomutoi bedakeon paratina polyplois boio thalasses pola depita paneutekion erato gereios Apollonia nacti τον εικόμος τεκελέτο. Κλούτιμε ο αργυροτόξος κρίσεν αμπιμπεμπέκας. Γιλάντες δατε έντεν εδόιο τε υπιανάσες. Σμintεουι ποτέ toi. Σμintεουι ποτέ toi. Σμintεουι ποτέ toi. Cariente pi neoniripsa. Eide potetoi. Catapiona meriekea. Taurone daigon. Todemoi. Grenoni eldor. Tisse andana oiema da curiua, soisi bellissin. Hosep hateo comenos, autu decliue poibus Apollon. Decatu limpuio, carenon comenos cer, doxo moisine conam perepea de paretren, eclang sandaruis doie pomon comenuio, autu kine tentos hodeie nuktie oikos. Hes de tepi tapaneo teneon. Oh no. Hes de tepi tapaneo teneon. Ooh, I might miss these. Darn it. What is he doing there? He's shooting. Apollo's shooting the stuff. Okay. Hes de tepi. He sits so far from the ships. Ah. Yes. Dine declange. Genet argure oio bioio. From the silver bow. Okay. Bioio. Silver bow. Okay. Then what's happening? Shooting from the silver bow. And bioio. Oh, right. Dine declange genet argure oio bioio. Ureas mem proton epoiketo. Kai cunes argus. Autarepit autoisi. Belos ecepeo que se pies. Pies ballai depurai necuon gaion totamiai enemar menan astrotonoi que lateuiu dei decatei epipres dei decatei dagoren decaleseto laon Achilleus toi garapi presi te ketea leokolinos here gedeto gardanaon hotirat nes contas horato. Okay. Das horato hoi epiun he egerten homegeres tegenunto toisindanis tamenos prosepe podaso kysekileus Atreide niun ammapalin plank tentasoio apsaponos tesiniken thanaton gepugoimen ide homo polemos te damai kailoi mosakaius alagedetina mantinerio menehierea kai onero polon kai gartonareg dios estin hos epoi hoti tosson kosato poivos apollon etatereo coles epimempetai ed hicatombes. Aikempos arnon gnises aigon teteleon buletai antiassa semin apo loigonamynai toi hogosepon katarhis teto toisidaneste kalkas testorides oio nopolon nokaristos Hoseide tateionta tate somena proteionta. Proteionta. Somena proteionta kai ne se gesata kai yo nilioneso hendia manto synen ten hoi pore poibos apollon hospineu proneon agoresato kai mete ipin O Achilleo geleai medi pile mutesas tai Manin Apollonos hecate belleta o anactos Toi garegon ereo sude synteo kai moiomosson men moi propron epesin kai loi epesin kai kersin arexi garuio mai andracolos semen hos megapanton argion gratei kai hoi pit hontaia kaiui Grison garbasileus hote cossetai andricerei per garte colon gecai autemar catapepsei alatecai metopis teneki koton opratelesei. Instete synheioisi sudeprasai e mesaosis. Ton dapame bomenos prosepe podaso Achilleus. Tarsesas malae peteo propion hoteoista. Magara polo nadii pilon hoi tesukalkan. Eukomenos danaoisi theopropias anapaines. Utis meus dontos Gaia pictoni derco mendoio. Soi coiles Soi coiles para neusibarias quieras epoise. Sympanton danaonu denagamemnonai peis. Hos nun polonaristos akaion neuketai nai. Kai tote de tarses kai euda mantisa mynon. Utarhogeu coles epimem petaeud hecatombes. Al henecare teros honeti mes agamemnon. Uda pelius etu gatra kai ucape dexata poina. Tu necaral geedocen hece bolus. Edetidossi. Ut hoge prindana oisinae ceeloi gonapossi. Pringapod patri piloi domenai helicopida curen. Apriate nanapoi nonagintiaren hecatomben. Exclusen toteken min hilasamenoi pepitoimen. I did it! Wow! I can't believe it. I was really nervous. That is the first time I've recited all 100 lines of the first book, the first rhapsody of the Iliad from memory. Of course, I recited it before for the audiobook, Iliad 100, and I've memorized each one of the 14 sections that I divided it into. But doing it all at once, at one time, this is the first time. And it only took about 20 minutes. And if you play the audio, it's about 14 minutes. So, excuse me, with my pauses and all that, that's pretty good. Wow! I can't believe I did it. I'm really pleased and excited. We have more to talk about, though. Hey, this is great. And you, wait a minute, and you out there, as I said in all those shorts. Can you do this challenge? It's possible. I actually put in relatively little effort over the past 100 days. Obviously, I memorized each one of those shorts that I did, which was usually just one line or 3, 4, maybe 6, 7 lines at most at a time. Even though I was doing much more work in the background on my own that I wasn't putting into reels because they can only be 1 minute long, or the shorts on YouTube, again, just limited to 60 seconds, 90 seconds, I guess, for the reels, but I use the same thing on the reels and the shorts. But other than that, just listening to my own audiobook the past month or so is really all I've done to put this into long-term memory. And it really works, just like listening to music, listening to a song. This method, this way I've adapted the Kephalos method, using this melody, the specific notes and everything, and just hearing it again and again and performing it as much as possible in the same way again and again. That's how I did it. I can't believe I did that. I was nervous, and I missed a couple things, but I think I still passed my own test. Let's go to the score, or the scoreboard, or whatever. I'm not cutting this, so this is all going in there. Okay, let's go and score how I did. How did I do? What's the final score? So now that I've successfully taken the Kephalos challenge, how did Kephalos himself actually come up with this method? Well, according to legend, he had a long layover, and with nothing to do for hours, on a whim, he opened the text of the Iliad. Now, up to this point, although he was already an experienced scholar in ancient Greek, he hadn't really delved into poetry. He didn't really see the point of poetry yet. But he knew the Iliad was important, so he opened up the first verses and he decided to just start memorizing it. And what happened was incredible. He found himself moved by what was going on, moved especially by the music, the rhythm of the poetry itself, moved by that dactylic hexameter, and moved to, over the course of 10 months, committing to memory the first 100 lines. And that's how Kephalos fell in love with ancient Greek poetry. In this way, he discovered something that was well known to the ancients, because that was the core of their pedagogy for their pupils. Have these young students, even though they barely know ancient Greek in the case of the ancient Romans, or they don't really know much at all about Homer yet, have them memorize passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey and make that the core of their education. Given that the Homeric dialect is so different in so many strange little ways from classical Greek and from Koine, which are the foundation of the prose of ancient Greek, rather than approaching Homer in the way that we approach those other kinds of prose texts, since one cannot write in the Homeric dialect anything that's prose, it has to be poetry because of all the weird things that happened in the development of the Homeric verses as they were transmitted over hundreds of years in the Dark Ages, all the way up to the classical Greek times, with so many weird changes and things. Listen, I talk all about this in much more detail in the video over on Scorpio Martianus. There are English subtitles, so you can follow everything there. Now, one more thing I wanted to tell you about is what I decided to do after I heard Kephalos teach us about this in an Ancient Language Institute class where we were discussing Homer. Because I asked him at the end of that class, how can I study Homer on my own? I find it so difficult. And that's when he told the story of how he ended up memorizing so many lines of the Iliad. That inspired me. I wanted to do that too. He said, you have to give yourself a schedule. He was right. He did it in 10 months. I decided I'm going to make it 100 days. That's one line per day. Doable? I wasn't sure, but I realized I needed to make this easy for me and as enjoyable as possible. Now, I knew that the ancient Homeric epics were actually sung. They were performed. In fact, that's why they transmit so many archaic, strange, unusual, non-classical Greek things into that time period. Core onion stuff from the Bronze Age that otherwise was totally lost but preserved in weird little places like Carre non eldor. That's core onion right there. That stuff is so strange. Now, if we just learn to recite the lines speaking them, well, that's fine. If that's what you want to do, absolutely do it. I wanted to do something else. Weird things like Atreides theanaxandron. That theanax, that is not how classical Greek works. That is not how Koine works. What you have to have happen is some kind of elision or some kind of synaleephy. Theanax can't be 3 syllables. It has to be just 2. Danax or Dianax. It has to be that. That's the only way it can actually exist in the spoken language of ancient Greek. So why the heck is it Theanax, metri gratia, for the sake of the meter? No, it's because it is preserving something really weird and really strange from a really archaic period, the digamma. In this case, there was a digamma here in front of anax. It was wanax for king or ruler or lord. So it was a consonant. Dewanax. There was no elision. Yet when that sound w fell out of the language, nevertheless, the meter preserved something ancient in it. It preserved these things fossils. The other parts dissolved away, but we still have the core onion. That's why I wanted to sing it, but I am not a musician. I'm not going to write a whole melody for these things. But what did the ancient rhapsodes do? Well, what they did was improvise melodies in ancient Greek modes, of course, which I don't know very much about, unfortunately, based on the pitch accents. That is, when there was a rising pitch, they would go up. When there was a falling pitch, they would go down. We can see that in the preserved ancient Greek sheet music that we still have to this day. We know that is how ancient Greek music was composed. Now, I'm not capable of improvising any true melodies, so what I did was set 3 notes, just a third, as my basis, as a sequence or a simple key, and every syllable would have one of those 3 notes. Like in the first line, Aeneid. So we have Aeneid. If you have an acute, well, that'll go high. If there's nothing on it, it'll just be the base of the third, and then sliding between those a mid-note, and that's where I put the graves as well. Now, why did I do that? Because I developed then a spelling pronunciation that was musical. Every single time I would sing or perform these lines, I would do it with the exact same melody, and that melody would correspond exactly to what is written. This is a highly simplified version of what the ancient peoples did, but at least it would be sung and it would be easier to learn, because learning a song is easier than remembering a poem, and remembering a poem is easier than remembering a piece of prose text. I figured, just as I remember songs that I learned when I was a kid, songs I learned several years ago, their melodies, their words still echo in my brain to this day, I figured I could make the same thing happen for me with that technique. And that's why I made the Iliad 100 audiobook, first for myself just to practice, and now of course you can get that too. So let's reflect on this Kephalos method, the way that I did it, and the Kephalos challenge. And to do that, let's start with some Q&A, some questions, and hopefully provide some answers to you. Those of you who asked on Patreon, of course, thank you so much, and from YouTube as well. So, from Mark, are you able to construe the first 100 lines of the Iliad in English or any other language extemporaneously? And related question, are you able to parse the first 100 lines of the Iliad at this time? So being able to construe or to understand into English every line, absolutely, I can. And that didn't happen right away. What I did primarily is try to learn each line, and really, as I was memorizing each line each week, especially in the first few weeks, it was the first time I had really looked at that line. Then when I prepared the audiobook, I wanted to nail the pronunciation better. Now, of course, something I did, as I mentioned in the original Kephalos Method video on Scorpio Martianus, I know what's happening in the story thanks to the English translation, and that's how I ended up dividing those sections so that they were thematic, so they had sense, so it would be that much easier to actually learn them, kind of like learning lines in a one-act play. So I can definitely say a line or two. Some lines, they're only parts of a sentence. You need to say 2 or 3 just to get to, the verb or whatever's going on. Yeah, I can definitely tell you what's going on in any part of it. Now that I've apparently actually memorized the first 100 lines, I could definitely tell you what's going on in every line. And as for parsing, grammatically, understanding the meaning of what's going on, absolutely I could. Probably just very superficially. I'm not a Homer scholar. There's a lot to learn about that dialect, of course. But yeah, I definitely understand it's being in English into another language. I guess maybe Latin or Italian I could try, but I haven't really tried to do that. That might be interesting. Breno asks, tell us your plans in doing other Kephalos challenges, or challenges like this particular one. And related question by Fediak, are you considering doing similar activity with other languages? So, absolutely. My next plans include, well, I have to choose which one, because I want to memorize the beginning of different pieces of epic poetry from different languages. So eventually I'll do the first 100 lines of the Odyssey, probably not right away. Eventually I will be doing the Aeneid 100, the Odyssey 100, of course, Beowulf 100, and even Inferno 100, Dante's Inferno. I want to do that. I haven't decided which I will do next, but I definitely will be doing at least those sometime in my life. Jeff asks, what steps will you take not to lose the verses once you have memorized them? That is a great question. I have no idea what would happen if I were to not interact at all with this text for the foreseeable future. I think, though, that especially because it was song, especially because I just forced myself to do so much of it from memory, the melody, the sounds, all of that is going to stay in long-term memory for a while. One of the benefits, I think, from this experience is that if I were to not look at any of these lines for a long time, but then I were to read them aloud, to try to recite them, like, say I'm in an ancient Greek class, say I'm teaching Homer. That's something I aspire to do someday. And if I'm teaching in ancient Greek and teaching about Homer, I want to be able to recite at least these lines fluidly. Well, thankfully, I would have the muscle memory of doing that. I noticed many times, even as I was reciting from memory just now today for this challenge, as well as the whole 100 days, because I had done something that had this physical motion of the mouth, because I was often walking and pacing and marching outside doing it, or inside, I had developed a kind of muscle memory connection. Like my mouth would physically go into the position of the right vowel, even if my memory was not producing the right word. Like, I don't know, line 100, which is eskrusen, and then be, oh, what little words? Like if I had to consciously think about these little words, which are these, I mean, they work for the Greek language, but they're just these little things that are there to fill in the rhythm. That's kind of how it feels. Eskrusen, and then what's next? And my mouth would go to tote ken min hila samen, especially this, gen, gen, that's not a classic word. Min, very rarely used. Those aren't really familiar words to me as someone who studies classical and Koine Greek regularly. And yet my mouth would go into the right shape, so I would get to the right positions, and I could do, tote ken, like if a men, and I might ken men, and then it would sound wrong because the I sound would be in my memory. Tote ken min. It was extremely helpful to have that to fall back on. But to answer your question, Jeff, which is a really good one, what steps will I actually take to remember them in the future? If I really want to make sure that I don't lose my ability to do what I did today, the very minimum, I think, would be once a month to at least listen to my own audiobook. At least the 14-minute version with the drums. I like the drums version, that's fun. Thanks again to Jonathan Roberts from Ancient Language Institute for recommending that. At least hearing that bit once a month. Breno asks another question. Why did you take this challenge in memorizing the first 100 verses of the Iliad? And before the Kephalos challenge, have you ever read the Iliad completely? No. I have never read the whole Iliad, not even in English, and certainly not in Greek. I've only read bits and pieces in the Greek, and the only continuous reading I've really ever done has been the first 100 lines for this challenge. In order to prepare me for reading Homer from any of the Rhapsodies, from either of the epics, to internalize a sense of the rhythm, the structure, the peculiarities so fundamental to the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the goal of memorizing some bits of the Iliad was to be able to interact with Homeric text, to just not be afraid of it, because it's intimidating. It looks so different from classical Attic and from Koine, but then you find, oh, well, actually there's a lot of this that's either identical or really similar or not that far off. And it takes this intimate familiarity with the text, or at least part of it, in order to gain that confidence. For example, if I were to look at, say, like the Georgics of Virgil, I barely looked at the Georgics, but I know the Aeneid pretty well, and I know the Eclogues really well. I have the audiobook, I've recited all the Eclogues, I've memorized part of it, I performed it, the first Eclogue, on my other channel, Scorpio Martianus. So I can open up the Georgics and easily read that dactylic hexameter, that Virgilian dactylic hexameter, and follow what's going on, and it doesn't intimidate me. Whereas if I were to just start with Virgil, like, where do you begin? So it helps. This memorizing, this forced, intense familiarization gets you through a lot of those hurdles when dealing with this kind of literature. Mark asks, what mnemonic devices or techniques did you use to aid you in your challenge, if any, and why did you select those mnemonic devices or techniques? Okay, well, I have this. So I printed out the whole 100 lines. This is right from the text that comes with the Iliad 100 audiobook. I just printed it out, and it has some notes. I'll tell you about those in a second. As I mentioned in the original Kephalos Method video on Scorpio Martianus, I already had structures in mind that I wanted to implement in order to make the first 100 lines as easy for me to remember as possible. So limiting not from speech but into song, not creating complex melodies but using the pitch accents themselves to guide that melody, sticking to the meter, being very consistent in my recitation, trying to keep that rhythm so that when inevitably going off of rhythm, the memory of that rhythm would carry me back into the line, into the word, into the sound, into the vowel, into the pitch. And then not using the same 3 notes for all 100 lines, but using one of 3 sequences or patterns that I used for different reasons. For example, the high sequence I used just for the priests And then the mid and the low, I alternated accordingly. Achilles, I gave the mid. Agamemnon, I gave the low. And that really helped. If I just needed to remember, oh, what was that? Oh, that one section, like the ninth one, happens to start with the word for 9 days, which is ennemar. And that's, of course, that division is mine into the sections, but it happens to be the ninth one. And ennemar, and I just remember the note, and that was the idea, that would all just reinforce, building up that myelin or whatever it's called that wraps around the neurons, really try to make it the same way as much as possible every time. That really helps. So there's a variety, but a sameness, a regularity at the same time, which really helped. That was the most important mnemonic structure. That said, how would I go about remembering other things? Well, let's look at my notes. So here is that text, which of course comes with the audiobook that I printed out. And you see I've highlighted stuff and I've done some different things. And I tried memorizing from the beginning, but I knew ultimately what I would want to do was to make sure the last sections were the most solid. And that even is probably reflected in my attempt to do the challenge as well. The most important thing I tried to remember was to really have clearly memorized the first and last line of every section. So I'd know if I indeed got to the end, I know, okay, that is the end, that's the end of this sequence, that melody, ready for the next scene. So I'd remember, okay, what happens next? O Chryses ad Agamemnona, when it, crisis comes to Agamemnon. And so that's the event here of that. And then of course, Chryses, addressing and so forth. So that's what the orange here is to remind me, okay, make sure I know the first line and the last line, and to make sure I had the first and last lines solid. Interestingly, this is something I only started doing a few days ago, because of course I recited every line for the reels and the shorts, but I had also recited the audiobook. But the second section here, the second scene, has 9 lines, and they can be divided pretty easily into 3 thematic pieces here, so that these tarspo eteo neridi xunhea ke makestai le tu sky diosu yosogar basilei colotes nusun anastronorse ken ole conto de la ui. I visually was also picturing what was happening, and that was thanks to the English translation to start with. And then, of course, the lines themselves, the vocabulary, all of it became very, very familiar. There's the plague, and then the crises is approaching. Why? To get his daughter back, what he's carrying. So when I printed this out, which was just a few days ago, so I could actually make sure, can I actually remember all of this? Like I said, most of my effort in memorizing all of this was just listening to my own audiobook and memorizing a few lines at a time for the reel. So relatively low effort. I could have done a lot better, especially in 100 days. There's a lot of time, but this was barely even a side project, even though it was something I was working on every day. Why is it yellow at the beginning of every verse? What I would find in trying to do this is I would frequently be able to do okay, this is and then I might be able to do something like the next line, and just remembering it from just like remembering a song, just the melody and the rhythm just brings me back. But then I might not be able to remember what happens next. Maybe the scene itself isn't clear, because I remember the whole gist of what's going on, but maybe not the next thing. The problem wasn't remembering the whole line. I have had every line memorized, essentially, just from listening to my own audiobook in the background of driving and doing work outside, knowing the lines, known them well, but the problem was then remembering how they start. As soon as I could, for example, cover this up, and I could get this far, and then oh, what's the next line? And then I just need to see, I would remember it. And so what I focused on doing was, in fact, memorizing the first and last line, like I mentioned, and also memorizing the beginning of every line. So then what would I do? What I did here are these little things. I noticed certain patterns. So we have a negation, negation, negation. In fact, the ud specifically 2 times, that's something that stood out to me. Prin in this line and then prin here. And it worked out. Obviously, if you go to Anthony Matevier's channel, there's a lot better and probably more effective memory techniques there, but these work for me. These definitely fit my life experience, my habits. I should probably expand my memorization techniques, and Anthony is a great teacher for those. So see our conversation together where we talked about this Iliad 100 and Kephalos challenge. Andrew Ellis asks, will your next mission be to try to memorize the first 100 lines of Virgil's Book 1 of the Aeneid? That is indeed on the list. I've actually already started recording it, so it will be an audiobook hopefully sooner than later. Mark asks, did the experience improve your pronunciation of ancient Greek? Yes, I was surprised that this really helped to drill into me the classical Attic pronunciation, a pronunciation I've known for as long as I've been studying Latin and Greek, which has been the better part of the past 20 years, but that I have seldom put into practice for the obvious reason that I felt compelled to come up with the Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek, which of course I started doing with my dear friend and colleague Raphael Torrigiano, and that I have since expanded upon. The Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek is a system or family of pronunciations that pertain to the Koine period. So everything post-classical and everything pre-medieval. Giving you 6 or 7. There's a 7th one that's coming up soon. Pay attention, subscribe, hit that little bell. I use the classical Attic pronunciation for these recitations because it's really the oldest pronunciation you could get to that we really understand, that works with the text that we have. What do I mean by that? The text we have is fundamentally an Attic Koine type one. We have, in fact, of course, the rough breathings in several places. We have hezdetai and things like that. The text was already so utterly mashed together before it was even text, before it was written down, when it was just oral poetry. You really can't effectively restore the text to something that might have existed even before the 5th century BC, effectively, because you'd have to change so many spelling things. You'd have to maybe write it out in the International Phonetic Alphabet. You have to do all these kinds of different things that end up really taking you away from the text. But the text, like I explained in the Kephalos Method video, more or less this exact text, which we see repeated in Plato and other ancient Greek authors, they quote it. They talk about it. They talk, well, about this line, this means this, and maybe we should, and Plato's like, maybe we shouldn't teach our children this, those kinds of things. And we have that exact text. So Plato and after the classical period and the Koine period, we have essentially the exact same text with some variations that have persisted to the present day. Ancient Greek scholars were debating which was the right text, which was the right form of this or that already in antiquity. So all that said, that's of course why it's in the classical Attic pronunciation, because that pronunciation is well understood. If you try to go to like a more archaic Attic or Ionic, you start guessing about stuff, which, I mean, you can. I don't mind doing all that. I love all that stuff, but there's just not a strong amount of evidence for one thing or another to make certain decisions. You start having to restore diphthongs like epsilon iota that were in fact a in archaic forms of Attic and possibly Ionic, but they were actually it was 2 epsilons together, make a long a vowel and others, and it becomes a nightmare. You have to start respelling everything, inventing a new spelling system, all fun stuff, worth doing potentially, but the text we have without the digamma, with the Attic aspiration, but that's about as far back as I was comfortable going. And by doing that, by forcing myself to recite these 100 lines, each line so many times, it's probably been thousands and thousands of iterations of doing certain sequences and sounds and consonants and really trying to nail down E versus E and U, trying to do O. I wasn't very consistent in my recitation today, doing U instead of U. U's fine, I guess, but I wanted to U. Doing these things was really fun. I think classical Attic is probably one of the hardest of the pronunciations one can do, though maybe one of the 2 Egyptian variants like Memphite is the Lucian pronunciation variants. That one maybe is a little bit harder because you just have to kind of think so much. Distinguishing the long diphthongs I and oi from ai and oi. It's a fun challenge. I think it's worthwhile. One of the best pronunciations that works with the orthography of ancient Greek is without a doubt classical Attic. Pitch accent too. I've noticed that my ability to do spontaneous pitch accent has been improved by having incorporated this conscious sense of it in the way I decided to recite these lines musically, following the actual pitch accent. Jason asks, the same method you used to memorize all those lines of Homer, do you apply that to memorizing other random things in life as well, grocery lists, etc.? Absolutely. Like I mentioned, I use Ranieri reverse recall, a fancy name for a very simple book and also for a rather simple method, which is to start from the end of something you want to memorize and build backwards. So starting with the first 7 lines of the proem, for example, to learn that quickly, to get it committed to long-term memory rather efficiently, I started with that last line, Atreides anaxandron kaidios Achilleos, and then I did the line before, Exudeta prota diaste derisante Atreides anaxandron kaidios Achilleos, building backwards, building backwards, building backwards, so that wherever I was going was more familiar, and easier to recall. Works extremely well for me, and you should try it too. Mark asks, after this experience, if a person chose to emulate the education of memorizing Homer, much as we believe the ancient peoples did, which is certainly evident just from reading Plato, then what benefits do you think that person would gain, if any? That's a great question. The point of the challenge was to put the method into practice of memorizing some amount of Homer, which is certainly what ancient pupils did in both the ancient Greek and ancient Roman world. They would memorize these lines of Homer. Why did they do that? Because they felt that Homer was fundamental to good education, the good raising of young people to have certain morals that are embodied in the epics. So there was some benefit there. From our perspective as adults in a completely different culture with very different modern languages that we speak and all kinds of other influences in literature, and it's all so different, why would we bother? I think one of the best reasons is so that we can, of course, appreciate to some extent the Homeric epics, but also then appreciate their being referenced by so many authors like Plato, like Virgil. You know, these things just keep coming up again and again, either directly quoted or referred to, referenced, hinted at in ways that if we don't know Homer, we're just missing. Therefore, just to appreciate ancient Greek and Latin literature, we have to know something about Homer. It kind of stinks, especially if you're only interested in Latin, and I discovered this very early on, about 20 years ago when I started learning Latin. I need to learn ancient Greek too. I would end up needing to learn a lot of ancient Greek to really get a fuller appreciation of the Latin language and its literature. João asks, how will you, after this challenge, take in or interact with the 101st line differently than you did the first? The melodies that I used, the meter, that structure, that's just part of who I am now. That's never going to leave me. Even if I don't remember every line perfectly, as long as I have some semblance of memory, I'll be able to remember this experience, the lines, the melody. They will always be with me, and I will be able to recall from memory a lot of this for a long time, even without reinforcement, I believe. And because of that, I have a pattern, a familiar foundation on which I can lay any further verse from the Iliad or the Odyssey, immediately feel the pattern. So the singing really makes it easier to get through those, and you are just used to these stumbling blocks now. Instead of stumbling blocks, they feel like leaping rocks that help you get across the rapids in the river. Thank you so much for those questions, especially to my patrons. I would say ultimately I do recommend this. I do recommend the memorization of poetry. Kephalos himself certainly feels that way, not just about Homeric verses, but about a lot of much easier poetry that's out there, because it brings you into the language in a very special way. It has been so much fun to take this challenge, to share that challenge with many of you out there who have taken it on. And guess what? You can still take this challenge. You can set yourself a 100-day period to memorize 100 lines, or just 50, or just 10, or just 5, as many as you want. I promise it will help you understand and appreciate Homer, appreciate the Iliad and the Odyssey, appreciate ancient Greek literature as a whole. It is worth doing. If you want to learn something about ancient Greek, you will learn a lot taking on this challenge. Thanks for watching this whole video. And thank you again to the Ancient Language Institute for supporting it, and especially gratias summas ago caritas pollas humin basi to all of my Patreon supporters. Hugianete kai walete. Just found a technical problem here. So remember this? The phone put itself to sleep after 10 minutes. So here, you see the time though? It's 11:10 a.m. Not faking that. Yeah, that's the video. This is actually the screen recording of the video. That's what's playing now. Yeah, so that's a shame. I did do it though. I did do it in that time. So look at me in the reflection, multiple reflections. So I did do it in that time. There were no cuts. I did not cheat. Anyway, I tried to do this as obviously, honestly as I could, and I did it. You saw what I was successfully able to memorize. Or disconnected my mic, so sorry about the audio change. But darn, that was one little step. I just want to really prove, especially because the first time I did it, all 100 lines. So just for fun, just a fun challenge. Oh well.